Why was no one looking for her? Why, in the chaos of burning homes and collapsing walls, did she feel like a shadow no one could see? Petra was only 17 when the war arrived at her doorstep. She was not a soldier, not yet. Just a girl who had grown up with a rifle in her hands and the mountains as her classroom. But that morning, the morning that split her life in two, she realized that childhood was over. The sound came first, a low, grinding rumble that did not belong in her quiet valley. She froze in the forest, cheek pressed to the worn wood of her rifle. The echoes bounced between the pines, trucks, heavy ones carrying men and weapons. And then sharper, more violent, gunfire, too close, too real. Her chest tightened. She knew the direction, straight toward her village, straight toward the only home she had ever known. She sprinted back through the trees, boots slipping on pine needles, lungs burning as shouts rose beneath the crack of rifles. Smoke. She saw it before she reached the tree line. Thick black rising in columns from her village, her world. By the time she stumbled to the edge of the clearing, the streets were already chaos. Flames licked rooftops. People screamed. Soldiers barked orders in a language that grated like steel. And through it all, she saw her grandfather. The old man stood in their doorway, back straight despite his age, eyes cold with the discipline of someone who had once been more than a farmer. He had trained her in these forests since she was 12, taught her to breathe slowly, to steady her hands, told her that patience was stronger than anger. And now, as the enemy poured into their streets, he pressed an old rifle into her chest. "Listen to me." His voice was steady, urgent. "Take this, take the pack, go the hunting cabin, you know the way." She shook her head, tears blurred her sight. "No, I can stay, I can fight with you." His hand gripped her shoulder, firm, unyielding. "You fight by living, you survive, you carry this on. Do you understand? If you stay, you die. If you leave, you have a chance." She wanted to argue, to demand he let her stand beside him. But his eyes, those weathered, battle-hardened eyes, told her there was no choice. He had already made it for her. He pushed her toward the back door. The sounds of boots and breaking glass filled the front of the house. "Go now, don't look back." She ran. The forest swallowed her, the shouts fading into the distance. She moved like he had taught her, low, silent, always stopping to listen. Her heart thudded against her ribs, but her mind was sharp, calculating. The hunting cabin, 3 miles, she could make it. She had to. By nightfall she reached it. The cabin sat like a shadow among the pines, surrounded by rocky outcrops, familiar, safe. At least it used to be. Inside, the silence pressed down on her. Every creak of the wood felt like an echo of gunfire. She waited, listening for footsteps, for her grandfather. He never came. Dawn broke with no sign of him, only smoke drifting from the valley below. She climbed the ridge with trembling hands and raised her binoculars. What she saw hollowed her chest. Soldiers patrolled the streets, trucks rumbled away, loaded with prisoners. Faces she knew, neighbors, classmates, the old baker who had always slipped her extra bread. All taken, all gone. She kept watching for days, hopping for her grandfather's weathered frame among the survivors, but hope thinned with every passing hour. On the 4th day it broke. She watched them gather the villagers in the square, watched them kneel in rows, watched rifles raise in unison. Her finger twitched against the trigger of her own weapon, but she was too far. Helpless. She saw their faces, familiar, human, terrified, and then the smoke from the volley. Her world ended in silence. That night in the cabin, her hands shook around the rifle. She pressed her forehead to the stock, fighting tears that refused to fall. She could run deeper into the mountains. She could disappear. She could survive. But as the wind howled through the pines, she heard her grandfather's voice. "A marksman is more than a bullet. A marksman is patience, focus, resolve." Resolve. The girl who had been told to run made her choice. She would not keep running. She would not leave her people behind to be broken, nameless victims in a forgotten war. She would stay. And she would fight. The decision settled into her bones like iron. In the days that followed, she trained herself harder than ever. Long hikes to distant ridges, practicing impossible shots until her breath was steady and her mind sharper than fear. She mapped patrols, studied their weapons, memorized ranks and insignia through her scope. Alone, starving, hunted, but alive. Alive and learning. And with every passing day, one thought crystallized, harder, sharper. They think they erased me. They think I am no one. But I will be the shadow they cannot catch, the memory they cannot bury, the ghost they cannot silence. As the first snow touched the pines, Petro, the girl once left behind, prepared for war. But there was something she hadn't told herself yet, something she hadn't dared to admit. She didn't know if she was fighting to avenge her people, or to forgive herself for not dying beside them. How much damage could a single shot make? That was the question turned over in her mind as she lay on the cold ground, cheek pressed against the stock of her rifle. The air bit at her skin, the November wind cutting through her jacket, but her breathing was steady, calm, patient. The convoy would come. It always came, every Tuesday morning. 3 weeks she had watched. From different ridges, different shadows. Trucks full of food, ammunition, medicine, supplies stolen from her people, now feeding the machine that had taken everything from her. Soldiers walked beside them, rifles at the ready, boots heavy on the frozen earth. They laughed sometimes, smoking, oblivious to the girl hidden in the rocks above. Had memorized every detail. The exact moment the sun broke over the ridge, the bend in the road where the mountain pressed tight on both sides, the wind patterns that carried sound and scent. Every Tuesday she whispered to herself, not yet. But this Tuesday it was time. Her grandfather had always told her that a rifle was more than steel and wood. It was discipline, patience, resolve. A true marksman didn't rush, didn't fire in anger. A true marksman waited until the shot wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. Now her finger rested against the trigger, still as stone. The first truck rumbled into view. Through her scope, she saw the driver's face, relaxed, almost bored. A soldier walked beside the truck, his boots kicking up dust. Behind them, 2 more vehicles, engines growling as they climbed the narrow road. Her chest rose and fell, in, out, in, out. One breath, one heartbeat, one shot. The crack of her rifle echoed across the valley. The lead truck shuddered, smoke bursting from its engine. It groaned to a halt, blocking the road completely. Shouts erupted. Soldiers scrambled for cover, rifles swinging wildly. Some dove toward the ditches. Others pressed against the trucks, eyes scanning the ridges. But was already moving. She slid to a second position she had prepared days earlier, body low, every step rehearsed in her mind. Another shot, this time at a fuel tank. Fire bloomed, smoke curling into the sky. Panic spread. She did not shoot the soldiers. Not one. She aimed only for tires, radios, equipment. A dance of destruction that left men shouting in confusion, unsure if they were under siege from dozens or hundreds. 20 minutes, 8 shots, chaos. And then silence. Through her scope from a distant ridge, watched them abandon the ruined convoy. Supplies scattered. Radios shattered. Soldiers forced to march back on foot, carrying what little they could. She let her rifle rest, the metal cold against her skin. She had done it, alone. But as the smoke rose, a question pressed against her mind. Why didn't you shoot them? Why didn't you end them? She told herself it was strategy, that terror would spread faster than blood, that making them afraid of a ghost was more powerful than killing a handful of men. But deep down, in the quiet place she didn't dare explore, she wondered if she simply couldn't do it. If taking lives, even their lives, would break something inside her she wasn't ready to face. She returned to the cabin with no celebration, only silence and the faint echo of her grandfather's voice. A marksman doesn't shoot for anger. A marksman shoots for purpose. Her purpose was only beginning. Within days, whispers spread through the occupied villages. Some said it was a group of resistance fighters. Others said it was a single phantom, a shadow with a rifle. Soldiers muttered about the ghost in the mountains and realized something unexpected. She was not alone. She found notes tucked into hollow trees, pieces of bread left on hidden paths, farmers and shopkeepers risking everything to give her information. One name began to surface again and again: Maria, a cleaner inside the enemy headquarters. Maria passed scraps of intelligence, overheard conversations, copies of patrol schedules written in hurried hands. For the first time since the village burned, felt a flicker of something beyond rage. Connection, trust, a silent web forming around her, made not of soldiers but of ordinary people who had lost too much to stay quiet. But connection carried its own weight. Every note she received, every loaf of bread tucked away in secret came with a price. If she failed, if she was caught, they would all suffer. The thought gnawed at her in the long nights when the wind howled against the cabin walls. She had chosen to fight, but now others were choosing her. And she wasn't sure she deserved it. Still, she fought on. 3 weeks after the convoy, she set her sights on a patrol that had been terrorizing farms. She chose the place carefully, a wooden bridge spanning a narrow stream. She lay hidden in the rocks, waiting, her breath slow, her rifle steady. The vehicles came, 3 of them, soldiers laughing, careless, weapons hanging loose. Her shot shattered the support beams. The bridge gave way in an explosion of splintered wood. 2 vehicles crashed into the rocky water below, the third skidding sideways. Soldiers scrambled, trapped, shouting into useless radios. For hours kept them pinned with carefully timed shots. Not to kill, not yet, just enough to keep them frozen, convinced they were surrounded. By nightfall, they abandoned the wreckage and stumbled back toward their base, broken, humiliated. And the legend grew. Farmers spoke of the sniper who struck like thunder and vanished like smoke. Children whispered stories of the girl in the trees, the spirit of the mountains. The occupation soldiers grew tense, jumpy, firing at shadows, avoiding roads, afraid of silence. But new legends had a price. The more the stories spread, the more the enemy would hunt her. And when they came, they wouldn't send careless patrols or laughing soldiers. They would send hunters, specialists, men who had built their lives on tracking shadows like her. And when they came, she would face not only their rifles, but the truth inside her. Was she a fighter, or just a survivor clinging to borrowed courage? The mountains would decide. What happens when the hunter becomes the hunted? Discovered the answer one morning in spring, crouched low in a familiar ridge, her rifle steady across the rocks. She had come to check one of her old shooting nests, a position she hadn't used in weeks, but as soon as she arrived, she felt it. Something was wrong. The soil was disturbed, pressed deep into the dirt, not careless ones, not heavy soldier steps, precise, measured. Someone had studied the angle of fire, the escape routes. Her heart slowed, her breath caught. They had been here, looking for her. She crouched lower, fingers brushing the ground. Small, metallic shards caught her eye, sensors, left in places she might step to track her movements. Whoever had done this wasn't ordinary. This was methodical, calculated. The enemy had sent specialists. And one name whispered through Maria's latest notes confirmed it: Captain Weber. She had never seen him, only read scraps of his reputation. A decorated marksman, a hunter of hunters. 7 resistance snipers tracked and eliminated in other occupied territories. He didn't rush. He didn't guess. He studied, waited, learned his prey. And now she was his prey. That night in the cabin, sat in the dark, rifle across her knees. For the first time, she wondered if she could survive this. Her silence, her shadows, would they be enough against someone who knew all the same tricks? Alone, maybe not. But she wasn't alone anymore. Maria had been slipping her more than scraps of intelligence. She had been sending people, ordinary villagers broken by grief but burning with anger. They wanted to fight. They wanted to follow the ghost. At first, resisted. The thought of others at her side felt heavier than the rifle in her hands. If she let them in, if they followed her, she would be responsible for them, for their lives, for their deaths. But the war had already taken too much from them, and deep down knew the truth. Her war could no longer be fought alone. The first to find her was, barely 19, his family murdered in the first weeks of the occupation. His eyes burned with fury, fists clenched tight even when he slept. He begged her to teach him to fight. But anger was reckless. Anger got you killed, so gave him patience, weeks of drills, long hours of silence, making him watch, listen, breathe. He wanted to pull the trigger, she made him wait, again and again. The second was Anna, 25, once a school teacher. Her classroom had been turned into a barracks, her students scattered to labor camps. Unlike Anna, carried no fire in her eyes. She carried silence, observation, a detail-oriented mind that saw what others missed, quickly realized she was not a fighter but a watcher, a recorder, the kind of eyes every sniper needed at their back. The third came almost by accident, Victor, a forest ranger before the war. He knew the mountains better than anyone alive, where the streams froze first, where the fog lingered longest, how the wind curled between valleys. His steps made no sound, his knowledge no boast. He simply belonged to the land, and now he belonged to her small circle. The Ghost had a team. Their first mission was not chosen lightly. The enemy's fuel depot, 3 massive tanks feeding vehicles and generators across the valley. Without it, patrols would slow, convoys would shrink. It was the heart of their war machine. Victor mapped the blind spots. Anna sketched guard patterns, carried explosives, nervous hands steadied only by firm gaze. She herself positioned high, rifle aimed at the depot windows. Her role was not to shoot unless needed. Her role was to watch, to guard. At midnight, the silence broke, crawled like a shadow across the dirt, planting the charges with fingers trembling but precise. Scope followed him, every heartbeat heavy in her chest. She whispered his breaths in her own head, steady, steady. Then 3 blossoms of fire. The ground shook. Flames leapt into the night sky, painting the valley orange. Villages 20 miles away saw the blaze. For 3 days the depot burned. And with it, the illusion of enemy control. But fire cuts both ways. Weber saw it not as loss but as proof. Proof that his opponent was no longer a lone ghost. This was organization, coordination, a team. And he adjusted. Thermal imaging aircraft scoured the forests. Tracking dogs swept through valleys. Roadblocks strangled villages. Weber's men began leaving traps in likely positions, baiting the ghost to reveal herself. But adapted too. She led her team into true invisibility. Never one night in the same place. Supplies cached in hidden holes beneath rocks. Tunnels through ruined farmhouses. Decoys, false trails, misleading whispers planted by Maria. And in the silence of the pines, the war between 2 hunters began. Sometimes Weber's traps almost caught them, a patrol waiting where she had once struck, mines planted on ridges she had used before. She could feel his mind pressing against hers, as if they were locked in a game neither could afford to lose. Other times she turned his tricks against him. Once she left false plans of an attack on a bridge. Weber gathered his men, waited for weeks. Meanwhile, struck a command post 15 miles away, capturing documents that revealed the enemy's supplies dwindling, their morale cracking. Each move, each countermove was a duel, invisible, silent, relentless. And yet, beneath the cold precision of strategy, wrestled with something far heavier. Eagerness, Anna's quiet eyes, Victor's calm presence. These were not faceless shadows like her enemies. They were flesh, trust, hope. They looked to her for direction, for decisions that meant the line between life and death. She lay awake at night, staring into the dark, asking herself, what if I lead them wrong? What if my fight costs them everything? Her grandfather had told her survival was enough, But survival was no longer hers alone to guard. She carried others now, and the weight of that responsibility pressed harder than any rifle. Still, she could not stop, not now. The ghost had become more than one girl. The ghost was an idea, a team, a resistance, and Weber the hunter was coming for all of them, and knew that the next move in their deadly game would demand more than patience. It would demand sacrifice. What do you do when the people who trusted you are marked for death? That was the question Maria's trembling voice carried in her latest message. Unfolded the scrap of paper by firelight, her heart tightening with every word. Weber had discovered her network, the bread hidden in hollow trees, the whispers carried in the marketplace, the woman who risked her life each day inside headquarters. He was planning to arrest them all. Not tomorrow, not next week, now. Stared into the fire, the flickering light painting her face in sharp relief. Every choice before her was poison. If she abandoned them, she would live, but they would die. If she saved them, she might die with them. Her team watched her in silence, waiting for a decision. Victor broke it first. We leave, go deeper into the mountains, survive another way. Anna shook her head. And what happens to Maria, to the farmers, to the families who fed us when they had nothing? His fists clenched. We fight, we hit them so hard they never dare touch them. Said nothing. She only listened to her own breathing, the old words of her grandfather echoing. A marksman does not shoot for anger. A marksman shoots for purpose. Her purpose stared at her from that piece of paper. Maria, the villagers, the fragile lifeline that kept them alive. She folded the note, slid it into her pocket, and looked up. We fight. Not just fight, strike, harder than ever before. Weber's headquarters was no ordinary target. The old administrative building was fortified, walls, razor wire, guard towers, dozens of soldiers, Weber himself, the hunter. But every fortress had cracks, and had studied them. 2 weeks of silent observation, long nights on rooftops, eyes fixed through the glass of Weber's office windows, guard rotations, vehicle schedules, the exact hour when exhaustion dulled vigilance and lights burned low. The plan formed like a puzzle, each piece fragile, each move deadly. Would strike first, a diversion. A convoy of fuel trucks passed through the town each night. He would hit them, drawing soldiers and chaos to the far side of the streets. Anna would cut the lines, telephone wires connecting the headquarters to the wider command. One quick snip in the shadows, and Weber's fortress would be deaf. Victor would cripple the vanes, explosives on the generator, plunging the building into darkness. And would step into the most dangerous ground she had ever walked. Across from headquarters stood an abandoned house, its basement tunnels connecting beneath the streets. From there, she could see straight into Weber's office. Her shots would not be to kill, but to paralyze, to smother Weber's mind in terror and confusion until nothing else mattered. The night came like a held breath. Lit the fuse first. Fire bloomed on the far edge of town, trucks exploding in thunderous roars. Soldiers shouted, rushing toward the blaze. Anna's scissors sliced through the lines. Sparks hissed, the wires fell limp. Victor's charge erupted. The hum of generators died. Darkness swallowed Weber's fortress. And in that darkness waited. She crouched in the basement, rifle resting on the sill of a shattered window. Above her, the headquarters stirred in confusion. Shouts, lanterns, Weber's team moving fast, trying to restore order. She squeezed the trigger. Glass shattered. A lantern burst. Flames sputtered, then died. Another shot, the crash of a radio splintering into silence. Another, so close to a man's hand he dropped the equipment, cursing, diving for cover. Shots came steady, deliberate, not killing, but suffocating. Every attempt to regroup she broke. Every spark of control she smothered. For 20 minutes, the hunters became the hunted. Weber's men, elite, trained, relentless, were forced to crawl on their bellies in the dark, helpless, outmatched by a girl who refused to show her face. Weber himself crouched low, glass and debris raining around him. Every instinct screamed to fight back, but every time he moved, another bullet whispered too close. He could feel her presence pressing on him. The ghost was inside his fortress. And then silence. Slipped away through the tunnels, across rooftops, down to the waiting horses Victor had tethered. By the time reinforcements swarmed the burning town, the ghost was gone. The aftermath was immediate. Weber's superiors raged. How could their strongest fortress fall to shadows? How could a handful of insurgents humiliate their best? Weber was not relieved. He was reinforced. More troops, more dogs, aircraft with thermal eyes, artillery to scorch the forests themselves. The mountains were no longer an occupation. They were a battlefield. And knew, as she and her team rode through the pines that night, that her victory carried a cost. Every civilian, every village in those hills would now bleed under the weight of her defiance. She had saved Maria, saved the network, but at what price? Later, by the dim glow of a fire, Victor asked the question none of them wanted to speak. Was it worth it? Stared into the flames, her face unreadable. The silence stretched, because even she wasn't sure of the answer. What happens when a shadow becomes too dangerous to ignore? The fire at Weber's headquarters was barely out when the forests began to change. Patrols doubled, then tripled. Trucks filled with soldiers poured into the mountains, engines rumbling through the valleys day and night. Helicopters circled above, their searchlights cutting through the trees like blades. Dogs sniffed out trails, mined old footpaths. The hunters had become an army. Crouched in the dark with her team, listening to the distant roar of engines. It was no longer about her, not just the girl with the rifle. The enemy had declared war on the entire region. Villages that had once whispered her name in hope now whispered it in fear. Every night she woke to the same thought, I have brought this down on them. And maybe it was true. Her success had made her a symbol that terrified soldiers but also provoked the fury of their commanders. One intercepted message confirmed her fears. Weber had argued with his superiors, demanded more resources, and they had given him everything he wanted. Tanks, artillery, enough firepower to flatten mountainsides, and one more thing, permission. Permission to do what ordinary soldiers could not. Collective punishment. The words froze her blood. If a village was suspected of helping the ghost, it would be erased, burned to ash. Its people marched to camps. The first time it was a warning. A small settlement, barely a dozen families leveled overnight. Survivors stumbling into the forest, weeping, their lives reduced to cinders. Held one of them in her arms, a boy no older than 12, his face streaked with soot and tears. His only words were a question. Why didn't you stop them? The question cut deeper than any bullet. Her team tried to ease her guilt. Victor reminded her that Weber would have punished villages with or without her. Anna insisted that what they were building mattered, cursed the enemy, promising vengeance in fire and blood. But in the silence of the night, admitted the truth to herself. Every bullet she had fired had led to this moment. Every victory had been a step toward this storm. Then came the ultimatum. Weber's soldiers surrounded 3 villages. They brought armored vehicles, artillery, lines of troops encircling homes. Through loudspeakers, the message rang out. Petro had 48 hours to surrender herself. If she did not, the villages would burn. The words echoed through the mountains. People wept. Some begged her in secret to run. Others begged her to come forward. And in the cabin, her team looked to her with eyes full of questions they didn't want to ask. What do we do? Demanded, fists clenched, fire in his voice. Anna's whisper trembled. If you go, it's over. If you don't, they'll die. Victor's silence was heavier than both. Sat still, staring at the flames of their small fire. Her chest ached with the weight of it. If she left, she betrayed everything she had promised. all the lives she had sworn to protect. If she stayed hidden, 3 villages would vanish by morning. Weber knew her too well. He was counting on her heart. He was counting on her guilt. But he had underestimated one thing. She did not intend to surrender. Not like he imagined. Wrote her answer carefully, the words deliberate. A message passed through Maria's network to Weber himself. She agreed to meet him, at noon, in the valley where once stood her village, her home. She promised she would come alone, unarmed. Weber would see it as victory. He would believe his trap had worked, but he didn't know the truth. That valley was not just ruins too, it was memory. It was terrain she knew better than her own hands. Every stone, every collapsed wall, every shadow. Months ago she had begun preparing it, not for surrender, for battle. While others saw rubble, she saw firing lines. While soldiers saw ruins, she saw escape routes. She had turned the bones of her childhood into a weapon. That night she sat in the ruins of the cabin, pen scratching against paper, letters for each of them. For Anna, Victor, instructions if she did not return. For Maria, a message of gratitude. For the resistance beyond the mountains, a record of what she had learned. Her hands shook as she wrote, but her words were steady. She had accepted her role, not just a girl who had survived, not just a ghost in the trees. She was the protector of her people, and if her life was the price of their safety, she would pay it without hesitation. When dawn came, she climbed to the ridge above. Smoke no longer rose from its ruins, only silence. The village that had raised her, burned months before, now waited for its final use. She lay in the ruins of her grandfather's house, fingers brushing the wood where he had once pressed a rifle into her hands. She closed her eyes, hearing his voice. A marksman is patience, focus, resolve. Resolve, that was all that remained. At noon tomorrow, the valley would hold her final test. And Weber, the hunter who thought he had trapped her, was about to step into a snare older than both of them. What does it take to face an army with nothing but a rifle and resolve? Noon came sharp and merciless. The valley of lay silent, the ruins of burned homes scattered like broken bones across the earth. For months, the place had been abandoned. Now it stirred again, not with life but with war. Engines roared as Weber's forces rolled in. 50 soldiers, armored vehicles growling, dogs straining at their leashes. Above, 2 helicopters circled, their blades chopping the sky. Weber left nothing to chance. From her hiding place in the ruins of her grandfather's house, watched it unfold through her scope. She saw the discipline of his soldiers, the tight encirclement forming, weapons ready. She saw the arrogance in the way Weber stepped forward, surrounded by guards, believing this day was already his. At exactly noon she stood. No rifle in her hands, no weapon at her side. Just walking into the village square, dust curling around her boots. Her arms were raised, palms open, every step deliberate. Weber moved to meet her, soldiers closing in around them. For a moment, silence reigned. Only the hum of helicopters, the faint clink of rifles as they shifted in nervous hands. Her voice carried clear across the valley, calm, steady. I am here, but you will never own these mountains. You will never own us. Weber's lips curled in a thin smile. Your war is over, girl. But's eyes, sharp, unflinching, told another story. And then she dropped the smoke. A hiss, a bloom of white cloud engulfing the square. Confusion erupted, shouts, boots pounding on stone, soldiers scrambling. And in that chaos disappeared. What followed would be remembered as the day a single fighter broke an army. From one ruin, a crack of a shot, a radio shattered, sparks flying, soldiers dove for cover. From another, the smash of glass as a sniper round tore through a lantern, plunging a squad into darkness. Minutes later, a vehicle exploded, not from a shell, but from a carefully aimed bullet into its fuel tank. She moved like smoke, like memory, striking from one corner of the village, then appearing 200 meters away. To the soldiers, it felt like an entire resistance force. They shouted about ambushes, swore they were surrounded, but it was only her. The helicopters tried to track her, but she vanished between walls, under shadows, always a step ahead. The armored vehicles rumbled uselessly through narrow streets, trapped by rubble she had prepared months before. For 3 hours, Weber's overwhelming force clawed at empty air. Soldiers fired at ghosts. Radios crackled with panic. Morale broke. Some shouted that it was witchcraft, that she could not be human. And from the hills above, villagers gathered. Word had spread of the confrontation, and they came silently, climbing ridges, peering down at the valley. They saw what the soldiers could not. One girl, alone, turning ruins into a battlefield. They saw hope. Weber's frustration grew with every passing minute. His voice cracked as he barked orders, his face red, his calm unraveling. This was supposed to be his triumph. Instead, it was humiliation. And then silence. The shots stopped. Smoke thinned. The village grew quiet except for the rasp of exhausted soldiers. From the rubble emerged. She climbed the old church tower, her figure clear against the setting sun. The entire valley stilled. Her voice rose, carrying across soldiers and villagers alike. "You have seen. You cannot break us. You cannot cage us. Freedom does not surrender to fire or steel." Then she did the unthinkable. She laid down her rifle, slowly, deliberately. The weapon clattered against the stones, and with hands raised she walked down from the tower. Weber froze. Suspicion etched every line of his face. Was this another trick, another trap? His soldiers closed in, rifles aimed at her chest. Walked with calm steps, eyes steady, heart unflinching. She had fought them with bullets. Now she would fight them with something stronger, the story itself. When Weber finally stood before her, they locked eyes. He saw not a girl, not even a sniper. He saw a mirror, a reflection of patience, focus, resolve turned against him. He ordered her bound, taken away. But the damage was done. The villagers had seen. The soldiers had felt it. She had already won. What power does a prisoner have when the chains are meant to silence her? The cell was bare. Stone walls, iron bars, a single cot. Sat with her back straight, hands folded loosely in her lap. She had been brought here under armed escort, rifles always trained on her as though she might vanish into smoke again. Weber himself conducted the interrogations. He wanted no mistakes. At first he tried force. Demands barked in clipped Germanic tones. Names, locations, networks. He wanted her supporters, her caches, her roots through the mountains. But's eyes did not waver. Sometimes she answered with silence. Other times with fragments of truth, harmless details, scraps that gave him something but nothing useful. And sometimes she lied, clean and sharp, enough to send patrols chasing ghosts into valleys she hadn't touched in months. The more they spoke, the more the interrogations shifted. They became something else, a duel not of weapons but of minds. Weber discovered quickly that she was no ordinary villager with a rifle. She spoke his language fluently. She quoted military history, dissected tactics with clarity, understood the psychology of soldiers. She spoke of patience, of resolve, of the burden of command. Every word unsettled him, because in her he saw the reflection of himself. Late at night, when the guards dozed in the corridor, their voices dropped to near whispers. Weber asked her why she had not killed more of his men when she had the chance, why she had fought with terror, not blood. Her answer was simple, because fear lasts longer than death. The word stayed with him. Outside those stone walls, her surrender had the opposite effect Weber intended. The villagers who had watched the confrontation told the story again and again, and with every telling it grew. She had faced an army alone. She had fought them for hours. She had laid down her rifle not in defeat but in defiance. Anna and Victor received her letters. They followed her instructions, carrying out operations with new recruits who poured into the mountains. Farmers, shopkeepers, even children running messages, all inspired by the girl who had proven the enemy could be broken. Resistance swelled like wildfire. Weber's reports to his superiors grew darker. Attacks, convoys destroyed, patrols vanished. What was meant to be the end of the Ghost had become the birth of something larger. The occupation command blamed him. His humiliation had spread beyond the valley, infecting morale across the region. Soldiers whispered that even Weber could not beat the girl. Every interrogation he conducted only deepened the unease. Never begged, never broke. Even in chains, she carried herself with the calm of someone who had already accepted the cost. One night Weber asked her outright, "Do you regret it, not running when you had the chance, not choosing life?" Her reply was soft, but it cut through him like a blade. "I did choose life, just not mine." For a moment, he couldn't meet her eyes. 3 weeks passed, and then the war shifted. Allied forces launched a major offensive hundreds of miles away. Weber's superiors ordered troop redeployments. The mountains, once priority, became secondary, outposts abandoned, patrols thinned. The resistance had survived long enough to see the tide turn. Weber visited her cell the night before he was to withdraw. His face was tired, his uniform creased, the weight of failure pressing on his shoulders. He stood before her, not as interrogator, not as hunter, but as a man who had played a game and lost. "Tomorrow," he said, "we leave this valley, but you will remain here." Looked up, her expression calm. "Then the valley will be mine again." Weber almost smiled, almost. When he turned to go, he paused. Keys clinked in his hand. A decision hung between them, heavy, dangerous, unspoken. In the morning, as his men prepared to depart, the guards discovered the cell door open, the gate unbarred. Weber gave no order to recapture her. He simply mounted his vehicle, eyes forward, and drove away with the retreating column. By dawn was gone. What happens when the war you've lived for finally begins to fade? The morning after her cell stood open, walked into the dawn. No guards, no rifles at her back, only the pale light spilling over the mountains. She didn't run. She moved with calm steps, steady as though the earth itself guided her home. At the edge of the forest, a figure waited. Victor, a horse beside him, saddlebags packed, eyes weary but bright with relief. "You're late," he said, his voice breaking into a smile. She almost laughed, almost. Instead, she climbed into the saddle, feeling the weight of freedom press against her chest, fragile and fleeting. They rode through winding paths, deeper into the mountains. By nightfall, they reached a camp where Anna waited. When stepped into the firelight, rushed forward, disbelief in his eyes. "You were gone," his words caught in his throat. "I'm here now," said softly. They didn't celebrate with shouts or cheers. They simply sat around the fire, the four of them, the silence between them carrying all the words they couldn't say. But the war hadn't paused in her absence. It had grown. Dozens of new recruits filled the camps. Young men, old women, children running between tents with messages. The Ghost had become a legend, and the legend had birthed an army. Felt the weight of it immediately. She had returned not as the lone sniper in the woods, but as something more dangerous, a leader. She no longer carried her rifle into every strike. Others did. She trained them, drilled them, taught them the lessons her grandfather had etched into her bones: patience, focus, resolve. Learned to temper his fire with discipline. Anna guided reconnaissance teams with sharp, watchful eyes. Victor mapped safe routes through the forests, keeping the mountains alive as their ally. Together, they built something larger than survival. They built a movement. Weber's absence did not end the war, but it changed it. The occupation forces thinned, their grip loosening as the conflict spread elsewhere. The mountains became a sanctuary not just for people, but for refugees fleeing from other regions. for the first time since the fires of Felt the Land Breathe Again. Seasons passed, battles raged in distant valleys, then slowly the war began to turn. Allied forces advanced, the occupation retreated, one village after another reclaimed their homes. And 2 years later, the war ended. The peace negotiations were held in a foreign city, far from the mountains. Was invited as a representative. When she entered the grand hall, journalists craned their necks, pens scratching furiously. They expected a hardened killer, the legendary ghost who had humbled an army. What they found instead was a quiet young woman, barely in her 20s, speaking softly about farming, education, rebuilding. She wore no medals. She asked for no glory. When a reporter pressed her about her marksmanship, she only said, "A rifle is a tool, but patience is a weapon that never runs out." Her words spread, not as propaganda but as truth. When she returned to the mountains, she did not resume the fight. She began schools instead, training young people not to kill but to defend, to observe, to survive if freedom was ever threatened again. The girl who once hid in a forest cabin now stood at the center of a community reborn. Her scars remained, some visible, most not, but she carried them with quiet dignity. She never saw Weber again. Rumors said he had been reassigned, disgraced, perhaps even retired in silence. Sometimes, in rare moments of solitude, she wondered if he ever thought of her, if he regretted leaving her cell door open. But those were thoughts for another time. At dusk, when the wind whispered through the pines would climb the ridge above, the village was gone, only ruins now. Yet in those stones she found peace. She would stand with her rifle slung across her back, not to fire, not to fight, but to remember. Because the war had never been about killing. It had been about endurance, about showing that even when the world forgot you, you did not have to forget yourself. And so her story ended not in gunfire, but in quiet resolve. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.